Hi there, welcome back to the last panel discussion of the day. It's not the last session, but the last panel discussion. And the moderator and curator, Khadijah Abdurahman, is already sitting here, and I will leave the stage to you in a moment. But first, I would like to draw your attention to some logistic things. We very kindly ask you to wear your masks during the session. And at the entrance, there are also medical masks available for those who do not have them with them. We have a translation into German spoken language here on site at Kampnagel. And if you want to try it out, just pick up your headphone at the entrance. Unfortunately, there is no translation into spoken German language in the stream, but subtitles. And now I will repeat it in German. Wir stellen hier auf Kampnagel eine Verdolmetschung in die deutsche Lautsprache zur Verfügung. Falls ihr die mal ausprobieren möchtet, könnt ihr einfach eure Kopfhörer am Eingang abholen. Im Stream gibt es leider keine Übersetzung in die deutsche Lautsprache, aber Untertitel. And for our viewers in the stream, if you need subtitles in English, German, Afan Oromo, or Luganda, please check the video description at the bottom of the stream. There you will also find the link to the translation function, subtitle function. And the subtitles in Miche will be unfortunately added a bit later. They will be available in the recording from August 29 at the latest. And if the subtitles don't pop up immediately after you opened them over the link, don't be worried, it takes about 20 seconds. So now back to you and the panel. I don't want to say too much, so I just want to remind you that we already talked over and over again yesterday and today about state administrative structures of care, but ultimately they function in colonial, exploitative, cis-heteronormative continuities as apparatuses of oppression. And in the next panel, these reflections will be sharpened once again and concretely directed to abolitionist considerations. And I will now leave the stage to Khadijah Abdurahman. I already introduced them on Friday, where Khadijah was also part of the opening panel as part of the curators team. Khadijah is an abolitionist whose research focus is predictive analytics in New York City, in the New York City child welfare system, and tech in the Horn of Africa. So it's very nice to see you again. And a big round of applause, of course. Applause.
First off, I just want to say thank you so much. Oh, we good? Okay. Okay, so first off, I just want to say thank you so much to Seda, to Lorena, to Lena Carlender for inviting me to curate events for this. As an American, it's inconceivable to have this level of state support around the year to fly people in and really like deepen cultural engagement and discourse around anti-colonialism. Where you guys live is really incredible, and I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. I'm basically a very excited person, and I'm happy to talk about any range of topics facilitated by my ADD. But also, this is something that's really near and dear to my heart. Unlike stop and frisk, which is when the police, typically a black man, they stop them on the corner and they frisk them, pat them down, potentially for arrest, but there are many other dispositions besides arrest, and it just takes time. It's like it's on public view, this form of state violence, versus in the family policing system, it could be anonymous, it's often never revealed to you who makes a call to the state central register accusing a parent of child abuse. But once that call is made, you're violated in the privacy of your own home. It's the most intimate form of violence. You know, many of you are here probably because you have strong political commitments and you're maybe willing to risk your life. If you were being beaten by a police officer, sexually assaulted in prison, I'm sure it would be very traumatizing and upsetting. But now imagine this happening to your child and being unable to do anything at all. This is the level of intimate violence that many of us on this panel have worked with people with experience, or for me, I've personally experienced from many different perspectives. And when I was so angry about this almost a decade ago, I had no platform. You know, it doesn't even matter whether or not you are revealing power. It matters whether or not you have enough power in order to force people to confront that revelation. And I feel like in the decade that has passed, not just myself, but this particular form of policing violence and ongoingness of slavery is being given space, being amplified. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. And so, in order to understand predictive risk modeling in the child welfare system, we cannot begin at the algorithm. I spoke a little bit in the opening panel that typically technology is exceptionalized away from its larger political context, but technology augments and transforms pre-existing forms of social control and surveillance. It's not this separate thing that happens out there in a vacuum. So we first must understand the thoughts, beliefs, and political projects that animate what Dorothy Roberts has described as the family regulation system. I also cannot discuss this research without sharing my own relationship to these systems. Academia has a way of taking you out of your social context and disincentivizing you from asking, what is this that I'm doing in the world? Who am I in relationship to the work that I'm doing? Who am I accountable to in the process of producing knowledge? Often within some ways at institutions which are themselves, as Fred Moten draws attention to, engines of settler colonialism. But it's precisely this relation to and of the world that grounds us in the research and the material conditions of the people excluded from academic institutions and the ways of knowing that are relegated to the periphery or to the margins. So in that spirit, I would like to share with you my relationship to the family regulation system. I am not an adoptee. Emphasis is on this point as adoptees are systematically excluded from research and advocacy about them. This exclusion is foundational to the category of adoptee, as adoption is a social contract into which multi-billion-dollar adoption complex, birth first parents, and adoptive parents enter into. Yet the person whose life is most fundamentally changed is never allowed or even considered for consent. Although I'm happy we do have somebody who can bring that perspective on this panel today, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a second. But for me personally, my first interaction with family policing was at a residential school or behavioral modification center when I was 12 years old. After being expelled from school for many grades, I was sent there to live there year-round until I was 17 years old. And the majority of the people that were there, and it ranged from ages 4 to 21 years old, were either children that were currently in foster care or international adoptees, typically adopted by wealthy middle-class white people who thought that they were infertile and then were able to conceive after the adoption and decided that that child, had such pathological deviant behavior that they needed to be placed in an institution. And then as I got older and I first had kids, I've also been under investigation by the family police. And then I also ended up adopting 4 of my nieces and nephews, who are now my kids, through kinship foster care. And so that's a little bit about me. And in terms of just formatting this discussion, I do want to note that Victoria Copeland, who is an abolitionist social worker who recently graduated from UCLA, is listed on the program and was supposed to attend, but unfortunately they're having significant medical issues and will not be here today. They're incredible, and please check out their work. And they've published, they've done a lot of incredible things, so please look that up. However, you still got us. I think this is going to be a pretty good discussion. And so first, I want to introduce Benjamin Lundberg Sánchez Torres. They go by they, them, or ella in Spanish. They use their art and facilitation to transform individual witness into collective action. As a queer transnational adoptee, their work resists the ways the state hijacks individual and collective bodies to fulfill performances of power across imaginary borders and boundaries. Lundberg Torres Sánchez's work has been shown in the US at the Queens Museum, Museum of the Moving Image, the Mills Gallery at Boston Center for the Arts, RISD Museum, and the Knockdown Center, to name a few. Their work has been presented internationally to Montreal, Mexico City, Santiago de Querétaro, and I'm so sorry if I messed up that pronunciation, Sao Paulo, Lima, and La Paz. They are the founder of the performance and exhibition series, Se Aquililo, and the co-founder of You Are Holding This, an abolitionist zine for and by adopted and fostered people. Lundberg Torres Sánchez was the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts 2017 and 2018 Merit Fellow in New Genres and Film and Video, respectively. I'm gonna read Dorothy, and then we can have a round of applause. We'll hold that for 1 second. Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law at University of Pennsylvania. As its 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge professor, she is also a founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent social issues in policing, family regulation, science, medicine, and bioethics. Her major books include Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as a co-editor of 6 books on such topics as constitutional law and women and the law. If you could give a round of applause for our esteemed guest, please. Thank you, and I just want to make one last comment, and then I'll hand it off to our guests, which, by the way, I never mentioned in order, so maybe one of you can make some kind of gesture if you would like to share about your work first. But the one thing that I wanted to say is, I personally really have a lot of love, appreciation, and have learned a lot from both Ben and Dorothy. But also, this is a really unique conversation that has only recently become possible. What I mean by that is that so little attention is given to family policing in general, and most of that has been so fragmented. There's adoptee groups, there's former foster youth groups, children's rights groups, then there's some stuff around Black impacted parents organizing, but it's very rare and feels very nascent that we've had more space opened up towards building these transnational, transgenerational, and trans-system kind of conversations. The political economy of private adoption results in very different destinations oftentimes for adoptees than children that are brought into the foster care system, but they're both animated by anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. I know just from an Ethiopia perspective, so many of the what is called Ethiopian adoptees were kidnapped Black indigenous peoples from the southern region. And now even how in New York City, how the foster care system defines or classifies by race. If you look under the category Black, it will actually, it explicitly names after African American, Ethiopian, along with Haitian, right? And then it's just African American, non-Hispanic. And so, the vestiges of these colonial and enslaving projects, go across both of these systems. So with that, I want to segue, and maybe would we be able to start with you, Dorothy, please?
Okay, I'm happy to start. Thanks so much, Khadijah, for that introduction, which covered so much already. And it's really wonderful to be here with you and Ben, and we just hope that V feels better very soon. We'll miss her. So I believe I should just say a few brief words so we can get into the conversation. And I guess I'll begin with my involvement in and relationship to the family policing or family regulation system. I actually have come to call it more often a family policing system because I think that that is what best describes what this system does. It polices families, just like criminal law enforcement does, and in fact, it's deeply entangled with criminal law enforcement. Both are carceral systems that pretend to meet people's needs and deal with social problems by terrorizing the people who are the most impacted by structural inequalities of racism and settler colonialism and homophobia and heterosexism and anti-immigration status and hatred of poor people and all of those inequalities. Those are the people who are targeted by this system, and it pretends to protect children, claims to protect children by accusing and investigating and terrorizing and taking children away. And also, if children aren't taken away, by policing families intensively, as Khadijah mentioned, and harming children and families in the most severe ways. So I have never personally been involved in the sense of the family police coming after me or my family. I have experienced the police coming after my family, and my former husband being incarcerated as a political prisoner. And I do have a long history with opposition to policing by criminal law enforcement and involvement with advocating for political prisoners. And so my very first experiences with carceral systems, I have a personal experience with that, but my work and activism against family policing stems, of course, from that experience, but also more directly from doing research and activism against the prosecutions of Black women in America who were pregnant and accused of using drugs in the late 1980s. I saw this as a continuation of the devaluation of Black mothers' childbearing and the devaluation of Black families in general, but the main targets were Black mothers who were accused of harming their children before they were born. And this turned a public health matter, substance use and pregnancy, into a crime for the first time in US history. And Black mothers were being treated in the most inhumane ways. And so that, as I was doing work against those prosecutions, I first became aware of the way in which the family policing system targeted Black families. And those very same women whose children were were being called crack babies and being predicted to become social pariahs and monsters and all sorts of vilifying lies about them, and then blaming their mothers for it. Those same babies were being taken at birth by the thousands. And that's when I first became aware that this system that pretends to be benevolent, to care for children, to protect children from harm, is actually a terroristic system that targets Black, Brown, Indigenous families in the United States after a long history of targeting these very same communities, which is, as deliberate weapons of war and deliberate means of enslavement and then reinstatement of white supremacy. And so I wrote a book called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, after I began to meet with Black mothers in Chicago, where I was teaching at the time, and learned their stories and wanted to tell their stories in a book. And I continued over the next 20 years to work on what I thought might be able to help, and we can talk about this more in our conversation, but realized that these reforms would only strengthen the system, give it an excuse to keep operating. And I became an abolitionist and came to see that this system needed to be completely dismantled and replaced with a radically different vision of what it would mean to truly support families and care for children and keep children safe, and no longer claim to protect children by putting them in a devastating system that criminalizes them and we, that we know produces hardships and harm to children and their families. And so I, over the last couple of years, have been working on a book called Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and how abolition can build a safer world, which was published in April, and have turned, while working on that book and prior to that, toward working with abolitionists to dismantle the family policing system and to build a world that no longer relies on taking children away from their families and instead truly supports and cares for children. And again, we can talk about what that would mean, what that looks like during our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. And I also do want to just shout out Ben as like the real MVP here because they're in Pacific Standard Time. So they logs onto this call at like 6 a.m. and it's not even 7 for them yet. And so, yeah, just like special shout out to that.
Thanks so much, Khadijah. Thanks, Dorothy, for setting up the conversation. My name is Benjamin Lundberg Torres Sánchez. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Ramaytush and Ohlone, colonially occupied by San Francisco, California. I'm a light-skinned person with dark wavy hair falling around my shoulders, dark eyes, wearing a shirt that says closed prisons in California, and semi-translucent white dangly earrings. I'm an artist, an educator, and a facilitator. As related to this conversation, I'm currently most committed to building relationships with people who are adopted, fostered, trafficked, displaced, with first and birth parents of adoption loss, with parents who are organizing against the forced removal of their children right now, today, in these systems. My connection to the issue or this conversation is that I was separated from my first family in Colombia for 28 years after spending 5 months in orphanage and in foster care on Muisca lands, otherwise known as Bogota. I was separated from my family by nonprofit workers, social workers, and lawyers who were administrating a private transnational adoption process, who first coerced my first mother into terminating her parental rights as a poor, brown, housing unstable woman living in a deeply patriarchal, deeply Catholic country of Colombia. I was then raised by white US American parents on Wichita lands in northern Texas. As a young person, I feel like my feelings of like feeling disconcerted about my situation, being filled with questions, and trying to make sense of how this context is shaping my life manifested early. I feel like most prominently as a young person in refusal of US American nationalism, or just troubling it through understanding that I had roots elsewhere. But as I became an adult, slowly understanding that so many of us in grasping for rootedness also rely really heavily on the nationalism of our first countries. And so that began to fall away from me as I tried to understand the entanglements between the US and Colombia, ranging from the war on drugs to just other kind of like colonial occupying forces and military intervention in the region, and starting to see that, of course, like my context and all of the stories that unfold from there are not just located here or there, but are in an international context. I felt like more unfolded for me as I was able to reconnect with my first family in 2016. I was able to meet my mom and so many of my family members, and just learning about our own family history, how there are cycles of family separation, ranging from when my mother and her siblings were ousted by our extended family after my grandparents died, and raised each other as teenagers on the street as housing unstable people. And then really, really importantly, the context of how I came to be in this world, which is through the violence of my first father, who was also my uncle, my mother's brother-in-law, who assaulted and raped her. And so thinking about my deepest and most intimate connections to abolition as a practice, I think about my first father, even though he is not with us anymore. He was murdered a few years after I was born. But thinking too that if I and so many people who I work with are abandoned by the state, I also too would not have wanted my first father to be abandoned to the carceral systems of prison. And for me, like untangling how I feel about just the most intimate violences within my own family is what really, really grounds my practice as an abolitionist. Dorothy and Khadijah both mentioned family regulation as a term. I use family regulation as like the broadest umbrella that holds practices like adoption, foster care, family separations in multiple systems, at borders, through policing, through so many places that we warehouse people, whether that's in mental health facilities, in elder care, in residential school, and of course also including the practices of surveilling families. As I said, like I'm most passionate about building relationships between people, and currently I'm organizing a group of international adopted, fostered, and trafficked people, not alone, but with so much support from friends and comrades who enter our virtual spaces to fellowship, to develop our own political education and analysis, to engage in creative practice, in healing circles, storytelling, all to ground further action that we can take with each other and folks who are impacted differently by related harmful systems. But I'll check it there. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I realize it's also, when we do events, we are being vulnerable with an audience that we don't often know. And even more so when we're doing it like this transnationally with you guys attending virtually. So I really appreciate the kind of vulnerability and generosity that you're willing to bring into the space today. And so You know, the thing that's tricky about family policing is that if you know about it, you're probably directly impacted, and you're living in a community in which like most of your neighbors and like your own family has been decimated, not just impacted but decimated. Or you know, it's like the most intimate thing that you've experienced. Like I think a lot about the idea of your birthday being like an adoption day, like the point at which that you're separated from your family for a lot of people who were adopted as a newborn. And so, but on the flip side, those who know nothing at all about this, the very first question is like, okay, well, you know, all of this is sad and there's all of these systemic inequities, but you know what? Some people are not capable of parenting. Sometimes harm happens in families. Like, you know, many of us might have had like a less than constant joyous experience in our own families. So what are we supposed to do about that? Like, what are we just gonna, you know, because it might be racist, are we gonna ignore like Black children, Indigenous children suffering? You know, what should be, if we're gonna abolish the system, how are we going to prevent kids from being, you know, murdered by their parents? And so I was hoping that, you know, you each could speak a little bit to that, and in whichever order you prefer. And also, this is very conversational, so you know we can ping it amongst each other.
I can go with a short answer. I think when I hear this question, which of course it's asked often, and it's something that we have to address all the time, I do think that it is a challenge for any person practicing abolition, whether it's towards prisons and police or the systems that we're talking about, to have the answer demanded of us constantly. But I do think that we do have some answers in practice, and something that is living. I think abolition demands a reframe of energy. I heard Miriam Kaba say once in an interview, it's that once she redirected her energy from plugging up all the holes in the dam and instead put herself to a different kind of task, which is creative, it's imaginative, it's building. I think that to me opens up a lot of different possibilities and different values too. And I think like when we're asked for the solution, we have to acknowledge, one, that so many of our most directly impacted communities had and have practices that hold these complex situations, and they have been actively suppressed by dominant cultures, states and governments, and that part of the violence of these systems are one-size-fits-all kind of solutions, a kind of regimented addressing of a complex issue that does not allow for plurality, does not allow for creativity. And so I think we have to both be dreaming and imagining something new, but also investing in remembering and a lot of healing and reclamation within our communities in order to bring out into practice and visibility and in relationship some of the ways that we've held harm for generations.
Yeah, I agree with Ben that we already know ways that our communities have been able to keep children safe, safer than the family policing or family regulation system does now. When we were excluded from those systems, or even before those systems were developed. And so we know from our histories that it's possible to deal with, yes, the conflicts and the harms and the other kinds of problems that come up in families. And I also agree that another part of it is that it frees us to imagine ways of keeping children safe, ways of families being able to flourish, deal with their conflicts that aren't harmful in the way the system is now. One of the problems with the family policing system is that it pretends that it's protecting children and keeping children safe when it isn't. And so it blocks imagination for other ways that would actually keep children safer and help families to flourish better than what the system does now. And I think we have to ask, why do people want to hold on to something that we know is devastatingly harmful, is so inhumane, so disastrous? Why wouldn't you want something that actually is concerned about children's welfare, that actually promotes children's welfare? Why not imagine and work on that? Again, using the ways that we already, have practiced in our communities and building more. So I always turn the question around and first of all point out, we're the ones who wanted children to be safer. You're the ones who oppose abolition, who are trying to cling on to a system that we know is harmful to children and their family caregivers. So what is your investment in keeping this system? Why are you so unwilling to dismantle what we know is harmful so that we can do more in building the resources and the networks and the mutual aid, I don't want to use the word, mutual aid networks and other ways that we know are better for families? Why not do that? I think we have not only the history and the imagination, but we also have the questions that we can throw back at people who are so resistant to building something that would truly keep children safe and support families.
Oh, sorry, Ben, did you want to say something?
Sure, yeah. I think I'll say just briefly, when I hear you, Dorothy, asking these questions too, I think so much of the investment that people have in these systems are really pointed at like the root causes for them. So talking about like racialized capitalism and the investment in fascism and just so many different kinds of measures and controls in the ways that our world is shaped, I think as I try to turn this issue over and over with adopted people in community, a lot of us are beginning to ask, what else is implicated? It's not just about dismantling family policing, but it's these root causes have to be attacked. Mm-hmm. How do we put forward a kind of program or ideology that suggests that we can't just be going for the system piecemeal, but that we have to be building with other kinds of movements and struggles for liberation, and weaving that struggle with things that are pre-existing and building really in powerful ways.
Yeah, that's so true. And what the family regulation does is it blocks that kind of understanding of the root causes. And I think, as you're saying, but not only for these systems, this particular system, but for carceral systems and other kinds of systems that uphold white supremacy and racial capitalism more broadly. That's what the family policing does. It says, this is the way that we should address the harms to families that come from racial capitalism, that come from the history of white supremacy and settler colonialism. We'll address it this way. And it blocks our understanding of how we need to have a more radical collective set of movements that are ending this underlying ideologies and ways that our society is structured. And so that's why dismantling the family policing system, I agree with Ben, along with working along with other movements, is essential to truly meeting human needs and truly resolving problems in our society. It's not that we're saying we want to ignore them. We're getting at how are you going to actually meet these needs? Because that's not what's happening now. And just one more thing, what are the real harms to children? The most of the harms to children don't come from their parents. It's certainly not the parents and family caregivers, the birth parents, the other family members who are caring for children, the ones who have their children taken from them. They're not causing the harms to their children. The vast majority of harms to children in the United States, which has an astronomical rate of childhood poverty, of other kinds of deep, profound failures to meet children's needs, despite the efforts of their families to do it. Those are the harms to children. We could spend all day talking about the structural harms to children, and this system and other systems that pretend that they're dealing with them. It just is a way of turning attention away from the true causes of these harms. And so, yes, I agree with Ben, as you start to think about it and think about the excuses that are made for maintaining all of these carceral systems, you see that we do need to get to the root. And the systems are designed to try to prevent us from getting to the root. That's why we have to abolish them.
I appreciate all of that. I wanted to add, for me, I think there's like a couple of parts. I think one is like, what the hell do people think is happening when you call this number? And part of that is like, everything people think about adoption, about foster care, about child protection is a lie, right? So it's pointing out things like kids in the United States foster care system are 41% more likely to die than children that are outside of it, right? It's pointing out that there's astronomically higher rates of suicide among impacted parents, siblings, and children who are separated from their families than with the rest of the population. That kids are 2.5 times more likely to be seriously injured, in addition to murdered, in New York City foster care system than not just the rest of the population, but even with parents who have a low socioeconomic status and have substance use disorder, right? And it's like the specificity of this violence, because it's not visible to everybody. You either have the misfortune of being in a social location in which it almost feels inevitable, or being completely oblivious to the fact that this thing is operating all around you. But I think the other aspect is like, it is hard to know what to do. I think for me with abolition, I feel like it has given me a really acute analysis of state violence and the recognition of organized abandonment. And then I think the intervening, though, against organized abandonment is much harder. It's not just the state that wants to dispose of Black mothers, frankly. It's not just the state that feels like you need some kind of solution for these people who just won't comply and like work and be able-bodied from 9 to 5 and adhere to the like educated middle class norms and be sober, right? And like, even for me, organizing in this space, like a lot of people don't want to work with impacted people, honestly. Like, there's some of us who we're like calm and like we show up on time and stuff, and we're at least like sober presenting, when we're doing events like this. And other people, they're erratic, they're all over, like people don't want to deal with it. And I think, like, yes, there's so many systems that are implicated when you think about family separation. But I think family policing does also have a kind of specific purpose. Because when you think about, they say kids are our future, right? And this is a profound sense of anxiety about the future, particularly in white-dominated societies, right? They're very concerned that white people are not producing enough and the domestic supply of infants. And then on the other hand, you have these people who are infiltrating, the German, the US body or whatever, with all of their their other cultures, their other norms and values. And will there be any more true Americans, true Germans, true Europeans left anymore? And we can't have all these blacks outside with nothing to do and no structured program. We have to control, we have to assimilate, we have to invalidate somehow. And that just brings me back to the title of this particular conference around radical care, because I think family policing is very much invested in identifying who is not normal as being defined, from eugenics, right, as the cisgendered, middle class, hetero, able-bodied, ideally married, citizen-holding male, right, and who's deviating from that norm, and how can we bring, the collective back into those metrics, and if they're not, how can we at least classify, sort, and remove them onto over here? And I think this bureaucracy, these processes, they get sometimes less attention than the analog spectacle of real violence, right? Of that, the moment of separation. But these are so critical because, look, if I see somebody and they're being harmed, it would be really nice to think that there's a hotline that I could call, and there's these people who just have skills and resources, and they come and they're like superheroes and they save the day. And I think, in Western societies, there's a huge investment and that there's some kind of procedure or protocol that we have designed for this. And abolition, I do think there's a lot of possibilities, but it's scary because you realize, we're de-skilled in some ways. We have a lot of strengths, and I think specifically around Black people and Black kinship networks in particular. And so it's definitely, we're not blank slates, but there's an asymmetry of power. And it's when you realize there's not this hotline that comes and brings superheroes, the onus is on you. And the onus is on us who are not normal, and and all the things, all the friction that comes along with that. So those are some of my thoughts.
Well, that was a lot, Khadijah. That was a lot. I mean, I think what you're doing is, forcing us to think about what, practically speaking, what are we supposed to do now? When, as you said, we don't have the power right now to develop a hotline, an alternative hotline that people could call and truly get assistance or truly meet the needs of a family. And we also have the disadvantage of the propaganda that this system has, which is one of the specific, you said so many things, but one of the things you said was about the specificity of family regulation. And I agree with you. I mean, as Ben and I were saying, yes, it's connected to other forms of oppression, other, carceral systems, carceral logic in general. But there is a particular role that the family policing system plays and family regulation plays in general that makes it, I think, even harder to get people to both understand why it's an oppressive system and needs to be dismantled, but also to replace it. So I in my book Torn Apart, I write a lot about the entanglement of the family policing system and criminal law enforcement, and point out that there are ways in which caseworkers have more power than cops. They routinely search people's homes without a warrant, and cops can come, almost literally on their coattails into homes to search them and amass lots of information. These agencies in the United States are increasingly entering into contracts with big corporations to amass huge databases about families and their social networks and use predictive analytics just like police do, but with less oversight, less scrutiny, both by so-called government watchdog agencies, but also, or courts, but also by the public in general. And there's a way in which family policing can monitor and surveil communities more easily than police can, criminal law enforcement can, and get away with it because it's supposed to be protecting children. So that excuse of we're protecting children is really powerful. So, one way of thinking of it is the family police can surveil and monitor and supervise communities without having to bother to convict people of crimes. They can just accuse, and that's enough. And even before going to a judge, and then judges rubber stamp it, and then they can bring police along with them. So, and that's the practical way. Then there's the ideological way, as you were saying, that there's a kind of accusation of deviance and monitoring of normative behavior that is deeper than being accused of a crime. It's, the accusation that you are harming your children is, and then that sense that, as you were saying, Khadijah, that we should have some system that protects children is profound and it's widely held. And the misunderstanding of how the system actually operates is deep. When you were saying people either are deeply affected by the system or they don't know anything about it, actually, they do know something about it because what they know is what's in the papers and the media, which is the cases where a child is harmed or even usually killed by the family. And that's what the public hears. And instead of saying, well, something is wrong, that obviously the system didn't protect them, what the public says, oh, we need more of it now. We need more surveillance. We need more intervention to prevent what are actually extreme and rare cases, and the public does not hear about the decimation and destruction of families and the broad surveillance of families. So all of that is true. But that's why we have to do the kind of work Ben was talking about that's so essential of healing and building and repairing while we're dismantling. I think we have to do both. We have to do whatever we can to chip away at the power that the system has. But it's absolutely true that people need something else. We don't want to just abandon struggling families to what is there's going to be something punitive that the state is going to use to deal with the fallout of racial capitalism. So we have to be building up, and we are, where people can turn to. And also that addresses the causes of unmet needs so that we don't have so many children in need. We don't have so much violence in families and communities. That is, I think you're right, Khadijah, that is hard to do. We shouldn't just act as if it's easy because we've done it in the past. I don't think that's what Ben and I are saying. But, that's the work. That's the work. I think I agree with you. I think that's the hardest part of the work. But as we are building up places where people can go they won't have to feel the need to call the child abuse hotline. Both are so important you can't do one without the other.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just add too, like when we're talking, I think one thing that is challenging when we talk about family is that everybody has an experience of family and like maps that experience onto how they address this issue. That's something that was brought to my attention really sharply by Khadijah's work. And I think that like troubling what we mean by family to begin with is a huge part of this work as well. I think just visiting other places and hearing people tell histories of their own geographies about how, oh, you know, like 50 years ago, before oil was discovered in this place, we all worked together. We would come out as a community to do a variety of kind of like public works projects and like have deeper civic engagement or just work with and for each other in a broader sense of like, these are my people. But I think like as wealth and privatization and also just the campaign to imagine family only as a nuclear family, I think has really weakened our ability to address issues in community with one another. And I think that's a huge part of it as well. There's so many things that influence us away from taking good care of each other. And it's along all these lines of, certainly like racialized lines, but so many people are Dorothy, when you were saying earlier about how just the claim towards a parent as deviant, unable to parent, and also just like by virtue of who they are, you know, that their family, their way of being or parenting is going to be infectious to the rest of society, is going to lead it astray in some way just by virtue of being Black or Indigenous or poor or disabled or queer or trans or a drug user or a single parent or a young person or any combination of those experiences. And I think because I'm thinking about like the isolating force of nuclear family, because my own experience as somebody separated from mine through these systems is that one of the deepest issues, I think, in trying to gather people and bring folks together is that these systems themselves, whether we're talking about adoption, foster care, or prison or borders, are isolating and separating forces and like influence us away, repel each other from each other. And it's extremely difficult to imagine connection with people because of that and because of like the intense entrenchment of like a positive narrative around these systems in just cultural storytelling. I think like adopted people are constantly sharing with each other, did you see this TV show, this movie, you know, hear this narrative come up in a song. It's so insidious and everywhere. The kind of positivist narrative about the benevolence of these systems. And I think like certainly like storytelling and narrative work is not the end all and be all. And I'm not actually, I think, interested in shaping the hearts and minds of people who continually refuse to acknowledge our humanity. But I do think that there's a lot of kind of gathering and narrative work that we can do with each other, and agitating people who do experience this don't have to have these like the dimensions of this issue explained to them. They live it, but may feel for extremely good reasons like deeply isolated from anybody who could understand or that they could find kinship with or build with. So I think like so much of this is about gathering, refusing the kind of like atomization of relationships into these like really small, discrete units that only take care of, you know, a handful of people.
Thank you for that, Ben. I also just wanted to acknowledge, like, I met some other Black people here in Germany. I've never been here in Germany before, and I was like, oh yay, other Black people. And we was chilling, and I was asking them like, what is organizing like over here? And they were saying like after the murder of George Floyd, that there were these big marches in Berlin and in Hamburg around George Floyd, and not for Black people who are murdered by the Polizei or the police in Germany. And that there's a certain kind of convenience to talk about white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and carceral systems about in the U.S. From Europe and in European institutions, and a certain kind of refusal to acknowledge, like, for example, Germany's own complicity in funding and making possible and innovating colonization and family separation. And I know the three of us, our work is like largely focused on the U.S., although also making transnational connections. But I do just want to like recognize the fact that these are systems that operate under other names sometimes, but definitely operate in Europe. Even for me, I'm learning about more of it recently, but I see a lot of Black African immigrants being targeted by various like child protection agencies. And this, again, the anxiety about like white replacement theory, and if the real Europeans are being infiltrated by like particularly Palestinians and Muslims. And so even though we're focusing somewhat on on an aspect of the US, I just want to put it in the space that Europe is definitely implicated in this stuff too on so many levels.
Khadijah, I want to say that like as we try to build with comrades in other geographies, like when we talk to people who, for instance, were like trafficked from South Asia to, a country like Sweden that is like really praised for its social welfare and safety nets and like all the support that they have for families, like still, the kind of like both disposability of people and their families and their kinship, and also the commodification of people through systems like transnational adoption, like really rear up and are so visible in those systems. Because I have a friend in Sweden telling me we have more or less eliminated the need for a child welfare system there, and yet people are still hell-bent on constructing their families by whatever means necessary. And where do they look? They look for children in the global south and in country. I mean, of course, like there's only a single direction of children internationally, from places like Latin America, Africa, South Asia, etc., like towards the US, Canada, and Europe. And I think like it's an interesting thing to think about when we have like people talking about racial mixture in Europe, and saying like when you have figureheads of countries saying this is our Europe is not about racial mixture, where you have Orban saying things like this and then like spreading this ideology to the US, like it's funny. Even I don't mean that like haha funny, but it's an interesting dynamic to say like that there's a deep refusal of intermixing within Europe, and yet Europeans will construct their families with other people's children through a multi-billion-dollar industry. And why are they able to do that? Because it's a project of assimilation. Because like the dream is that this child is not actually Black, is not actually brown, is not actually rooted elsewhere. They will just become a part of my family unit, my national unit. They can be remade and reshaped in the image of whiteness, Europeanness. And basically just have their culture hijacked and replaced.
1,000. I just wanted to say, sorry to cut you off, Dorothy. I just wanted to mention one thing is that, like, the impact of QAnon is such that people don't even realize this exists in the U.S., although very recently, the New Yorker did a story on the Kendler experiment, the formal program in Germany where children in foster care were formally placed with pedophiles, most of whom were academics. And two of the people that they profiled in the New Yorker in this piece, one of the kids who was brought into one of these homes was Roma, and the other one was Palestinian. And so and both of them had parents, right? So it just shows you, like, when we're thinking about colonization, it's not this thing that's outside or separate. Like those, when we say Black and brown in New York City foster care, like in addition to African Americans, we're often looking at Puerto Ricans, we're looking at indigenous Central Americans. And so like these global politics often are like very distilled in family policing systems. But go ahead, Dorothy.
Yes, so I agree that it's so important to understand how settler colonialism and global colonialism, both of them, so in the case of Europe, colonizing other parts of the world, and this idea of European dominance and civilizing other parts of the world is reflected in ideologies that Ben and you, Khadijah, were talking about, of commodifying children from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and saving them, civilizing them, assimilating them into white European culture and society. That ideology still exists in Europe today. And so it's simply not true that Europe is this ideal place, I think, where they have great social welfare systems. And as Ben was saying, this idea that they have eliminated, these problems with child welfare systems. No, they haven't at all. They still exist to this day, including something I've been learning about recently, is the way in which some of the nations that have the strongest child welfare systems, like Sweden and the Netherlands, and the UK, that they have been surveilling, stigmatizing, destroying families of African immigrants. And so this ideology of child saving, of assimilation, of civilizing, of conforming, and punishing families that don't conform to a norm is present in Europe today. And so one lesson that I've taken from it is that, and I think I've been too guilty of this, pointing to strong social welfare safety nets as, being, I've never said that's the only answer, but, I think I haven't complicated enough how even those strong social safety nets can be extremely oppressive to families that don't conform, either in terms of their race, their ethnicity, their immigration status, their cultural forms of family. We have to always continue to be vigilant and active against the ways in which family regulation operates, even within a strong government social safety net. Any strong government social safety network can still be racist and white supremacist and colonial, and treat the families that don't fit the norm that's imposed by that state vision of what's a deserving family, who should get who's entitled to the benefits. I mean, we see this already in the US with the elimination of the federal guarantee to welfare and turning it into a behavior modification system that's completely, TANF, completely punitive and not at all geared toward meeting the needs of children and families. So we could already see that in the United States, but it's not that now putting welfare back, is going to be the answer either. So I think the experience in Europe is a lesson of the limits of government welfare to address the oppression of family regulation.
No, for sure. And this conversation I had yesterday, I had dropped a book somewhere here. I think they recovered it for me. I'm like halfway through this book, which I believe you might have even endorsed, Dorothy, by Crystal Lynn Webster, Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African American Children in the Antebellum North. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because she raises how, like, in this like post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction era, how there were like institutional resources allocated towards white children, even white children who were formerly indentured servants, but those same resources weren't allocated towards African American children, not just because they weren't necessarily deserving of resources, but inherently the notion of childhood was very much wrapped around the notion of whiteness and white innocence, and that's part of like the worthiness. And so a lot of times I think even our concepts of parenting and of family are so caught up in that a black parent is always deemed like harboring a potential criminal because of their own like intrinsic identity on top of the kids, right? And so our black children seem with the same innocence. Although I do go back and forth on that because people often talk about the racial bias against black parents or like parents of color, and I'm like, if you go to a white middle class neighborhood in the middle of a workday, who's watching all these white children? They're like African, Caribbean nannies, Filipino. So I mean, they seem to think that like we're very capable of raising their own children. So that's why I'm always like trying to think and like wrap my head around family policing. And you both touched on this a little bit. And so I do on one hand agree, like I'm not gonna debate my humanity, with the right. But there's all these different contestations around the abolition of family policing. And one of them that I've encountered on the left is, and I know I wrote you guys an email about this earlier today, but that you have in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels are like, yo, we should abolish the family. It's both a vestige, it's a social structure that's a vestige of feudalism, and it's holding us back, right? And it came from, almost some of the arguments that you hear justifying transphobia or queerphobia, right? That like white people brought this stuff, and in order to be liberated, we have to get rid of families. And like similarly, there's it's often make political demands around the family is often associated with the right, that the right thinks about focus on the family. And I've seen a lot of mostly like white LGBTQ adoptive parents really push back against adoptees because they're like, this is our right to build a family. This is the way that we can have access to this. And like, aren't you being, homophobic? So this is all to say, like, how do you conceptualize demanding the reuniting, the protection of families, of Black and Indigenous families in particular, and also not underwriting like traditional patriarchal norms? Like, how do you think about that? And what does the family have to do with whatever is our vision for liberation?
Khadijah, just because you're talking about queer kinship at the tail end of your comments, I think like there's so much that prior to kind of like this pinkwashing moment where like we're trying to like get marriage equality and these kinds of like rights-based fights, as instead of like organizing as queer people for like housing and healthcare and all of these other things that would support our like continuance and thriving and ability to like be in relationship with each other. I think queer community and queer kinship has already shown us that like we don't need the state to administrate that. We don't need to construct ways of being with each other with that kind of system or like support or aid. And I think that's something that we can remember like when we're both defining what family is and how it comes to be and how it continues. I've also like some of your comments just now like made me think about things that very newly contemplating about the fear of just the figure of the bastard, a a child that is somehow like unmoored from this kind of, as you're saying, maybe today is framed as like the traditional family, and how just if you're talking about family as a vestige of the feudal structure and the way that people accessed things like protection and their livelihoods and ability to just exist, like it's so often attached to having a relationship to a family, or your lord's family, having this kind of like ability to trace your lineage and have rootedness somewhere, in some kind of social context. I think it's like telling that a lot of that, what was offered to people in the feudal system was protection, in this kind of like extended family of your immediate kin, but also the house of your lord. I think, it trips me out, like when my mom in Colombia like addresses me su merced, like my lord. Like it's a vestige of like the way that the system has been like propagated through through the plantation, through haciendas, through like so many different ways that people are relating to the place where they are and the relations of power that are there. And even like it's complicated. So me coming with US American dollars to my Colombian family and then being addressed that way, it's like, it's so deeply entrenched from every which way down to culture and language. So those are a few like disparate or scattered thoughts, but I think I am interested in this question of like how definitions of family that we use popularly today and seem to be like, as with so many things, like whether it's mass incarceration or a definition of family, just seem to become naturalized. Oh, this is the way that it's always been. I can't imagine a reality outside of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have some disparate thoughts as well about what you said. And thanks, Ben, for those ideas about the family. I think that the movement to abolish family policing is a movement both to value families and to end the disruption and devaluation and punishment of families, but it's also a movement to question and trouble the traditional notions of family. I mean, after we've been talking today, we've been pointing out how this is a system that punishes families that don't conform to the norms. So we're fighting against a system. We want to end a system that is one of the most powerful ways, as both of you has talked about family regulation. We've been talking about this powerful way of getting families to conform to a norm and punishing the ones that don't. So I don't see abolition at all as upholding some oppressive view of family or some traditional view of family. I think it's the opposite. It's part of our work to question what family means and to oppose a system that regulates and punishes families that don't conform. So that's why I think we are opposing the right wing's co-optation, of family. They want to impose a particular form of family and then keep the government out of this one form of, nuclear, heterosexual, white, the image is white Christian family. And they don't want the government to interfere with that, but they want to uphold this very narrow, particular form of family. And they do not support policies that would enable other families to flourish at all. They support families that would policies that would punish those families, that would keep support from those families that don't conform to their view. So again, family policing abolitionists oppose the right wing's notion of family, and that made me think. Ben, when you were talking about this longstanding view of family that continues, and the serfs and the feudal. I was thinking about the plantation family during slavery, and that was an idea of family that made the white husband the head of the entire plantation, including the enslaved people who worked there that he had complete control over. So there's an idea of family that isn't about a nuclear family. It's about a white man controlling everybody on the plantation, and separating Black families was an integral part of it. So they had no problem breaking up enslaved families. They didn't even see them as having any kind of legal autonomy or rights or anything like that. So the whole idea that, the US has this longstanding history of the nuclear family and protecting the rights of the nuclear, that's a bunch of bull. It hasn't. It's always been a notion of family that upholds white supremacy and settler colonialism and racism. That's what abolitionists oppose, going back to what we were saying before. Then on the left, the people on the left that have a problem with abolishing family policing, I think that they need to question why, again, as I said before, why I ask, what is your investment in not wanting to change? And so what's your investment in upholding the system we have now? And there are people who identify as being on the left who have an investment in a racist system. They do. And we should challenge them just like we challenge other people, just like we challenge ourselves, our own principles and our own actions. Yes, the fact that somebody comes from a family that or is building a family that doesn't conform to the, heterosexist norm doesn't mean that they may not also have ideas that need to be questioned. And so I think that for a long time, white feminists in America challenged any kind of protection for the family on grounds that it was the bastion of male violence. And some Black feminists, including myself, we pointed out, well, yeah, but guess what? Families have also been, defined broadly, because Black communities have defined family traditionally very broadly in terms of kin networks, even people who aren't related genetically as being, auntie, neighbors, and the kind of thing that Ben is talking about, community networks that go beyond the traditional nuclear family. And I think we have to recognize the importance of families. Again, we could question the definition of what that means, but families, people who consider themselves families, being important guards against a racist society. That's where people have turned to have their needs met, have to resist. Again, in collective action, ideally. I agree with Ben that just thinking about just your family by itself as being, who's going to protect you is too limiting. But families do play an important role. That's why destroying families has always been a weapon of war by the U.S. government. Why did the U.S. government in the 1800s decide, we're going to take up this weapon in our wars against indigenous people? Why did they decide strategically that an important weapon against Native tribes was to take their children. It was because they recognized that their families and that was a way to destroy tribes. That was a way to wage a war against Native sovereignty. So that should tell you that families play an important role in resisting against white supremacy and colonialism. And I think we have to recognize that, as we are, yes, questioning what do we mean by families. We don't want to have a movement that is upholding. Oh, let me just say one more thing. When it comes to LGBTQ people and the idea that family policing is against their interests, think about Governor Greg Abbott deploying caseworkers in the family policing system in Texas to attack families that supported their trans children. He used the child welfare system. I think the policy is still in place. I haven't followed it. It was in place, it was challenged, it was put back in place. But he used that policy deliberately because he knew it was an effective tool to attack trans children in Texas. And again, we have to pay attention to how this system is being deployed to destroy families that don't conform and to force conformity to a heterosexist, white, nuclear family.
Thank you so much. I do want to flag, I'm sorry, I'm even cutting off the applause. So in Germany, they're very efficient and they end on time all the time.
Oh.
And so we have 4 minutes. I'm going to monopolize 2. And then, Ben, I want to give you an opportunity to make a last comment. One, just like scrolling back to your earlier point about like bastards. I think about ACAB, right? All cops are bastards, and just like, you have this idea of so it's pretty deep, this question around family separation, anxiety about orphans, right? Within like even just the most marketable abolitionist rhetoric, right? So I just want to put that there for a second. The second thing I wanted to say, you had mentioned pink washing before, and I became more deeply engaged with that term and the concept of queer necropolitics when I started reading Jasbir Pawar's work, Terrorist Assemblages and the Right to Maim, and trying to understand ACS, or the New York City Administration for Children's Services, branding itself as so pro-LGBTQ, and in its trainings really being extremely pro-white middle-class cis gay men adopting Black children from communities always deemed homophobic all the time. And so it really helped me understand that. And in terms of this question around genetics and abolishing the family, I think it's about investments in the system, but also when I hear people think of a utopia in which there are no families, it reminds me of people who think of a utopia in which there are no disabled people, like the idea that you want this cure. And so you have on one hand, where's the primary pinkwashing? Israel, right? And so Israel's one of its primary exports is the weapons that it develops to maintain the occupation against Palestine, and one of the things Pawar really points out is how they use bullets to target the limbs of children. And then this is again used in Kashmir, where not only they have rubber bullets that embed in people's eyes in order to blind them and incapacitate the family and the kinship network, so they have to take care of young people protesting. But the other major technology that's really been at the forefront with Israel is assistive reproductive technology, and pushing for chronic villus sampling and eliminating people with Down syndrome, and also sperm donors. And so this was really interesting to me to learn about politically, because I have not been directly impacted by sperm donation, but meeting people who are the children of donors, they have really emphasized how family is not just who you choose. There is something about this genetics, wanting a genetic mirror, wanting to know who your father is and was, like even if they're a terrible person, like wanting and craving that connection, wanting to know your siblings. And so I think there's something there about like, why do we want a future? It makes sense that we want to divest from relationships with carceral systems and occupations, but why do we want to divest from this most intimate relationship? And it's 4:59, so I'm so sorry, Ben. Go ahead. You can make your last comment.
Yeah, so I'll try to bullet point some thoughts. Yeah, I think that just like contemporary humanities, like just really has put forward this idea that anything essentialist is like, oh, we don't want to touch that. That's not something we believe in. And of course, like I don't think that people are saying like, oh, the ability for me to be in my family and just have that. Like it's not about like a like totally rosy idea of what that family could be. It's absolutely what you're talking about. It's about rootedness. It's about like my ability to access the knowledge and decide what I do next with it. I am trying to like pull together lots of things that you said. I think in this like final comment, like it also bears mentioning, like speaking of queer kinship and race, like that Black and Indigenous queer women are disproportionately targeted by systems. And I noticed that in adopted person communities, so often the issue gets siloed to just the fact of being adopted versus like pulling in all these other rich experiences that we have in community, like being queer, like being disabled. I want to track back to the fact that adoption marketplaces follow US American theaters of war globally, and that children are taken from geographies where we are waging war and quickly trafficked into an assimilationist system. And we see that in adoption marketplaces, all the people who, even just like the hierarchy of which young people are valued more or less, follows these same kinds of like assimilationist tendencies. Like, let's market Black children as cheaper to acquire within the system so that they are shuttled faster and with financial incentives towards white middle-class Christian abled families. Same with disabled children. If you are a potential adopting parent and you want your name to come up on that list faster, say you'll accept a child who is outside of your racial group. Say that you will accept a child with a physical or developmental disability. In my own case, I landed with my parents because they said that they would accept a child with a heart defect, even though that ended up not being actually the reality of my life and my body. But yeah, these things like. Oh, and then just one final thing I wanted to make sure like gets out into the space of this talk is too, just when we're talking about this kind of like policy in the US of kill the Indian, save the child or the man, we can see right now it's not just like the prototypical origins of child welfare in the US. It's what is currently happening in the kind of war our state is waging against Indigenous people, that a case about family separation, about Indigenous children in the Indigenous Child Welfare Act going to the Supreme Court is absolutely primarily, ultimately about eroding Indigenous sovereignty. And so it's not just about whether or not Native children get to stay within their kinship networks and communities, but it is like a dedicated project by the United States to make sure that Indigenous people are assimilated out of existence.
Thank you both so much. I'm sorry to end so abruptly, but we're definitely 2 minutes over, and I just want to just thank you so much. And please, if you could give them a round of applause.
Yeah, wow, such a powerful discussion. Thank you so much. That was our panel discussion on abolishing the child welfare system and its algorithms. I'm sure it also helped many people to get a more concrete understanding of this ominous term of abolition, which is also there are a lot of discussions also on this term in Germany in the recent months and years, and that it doesn't just mean abolishing the police, so we don't want police anymore, so we don't, but it concerns all social spheres of community and care, the very fundamental way in which we are organized with each other and take care of the most vulnerable individuals and groups. And also, like Dorothy also underlined, dismantling the core of capitalist, colonial, patriarchal systems and ideologies. Thank you so much. And with these thoughts, we are already nearly at the end of the conference. We meet again at 6 p.m. for the final performance by the wonderful Neve, curated by Grayson Brillmeyer. The performance will have audio description in German and a short tactile tour. For that, we meet at 5:45 on the piazza in front of the entrance to the box office. So, see you later. Thank you so much again.
Bye, Ben and Dorothy.